Now we're going to configure a web service via API, and the approach we're going to take is via self-hosting. Essentially, an application will host the web service. To get started, the first thing you do is create an instance of the service host class. Then you call add service endpoint with that instance, passing in the address, binding, and contract that you need. And that's all you need to do. Let me show you how. Here we have a web service project that we want to configure via API. To do this, we're going to add an application to act as service host. I'll right click, select Add, New Project, and it'll be a console application. We'll make it the startup project, and we need to add a couple references. First, we need the web service itself. And we also need system.serviceModel for WCF types. Now we have a project with the references. We can create an instance of service host. And that's in the system.serviceModel namespace. Service host takes a parameter of the web service type. And that's in the web service namespace. Now that we have an instance of service host, we can create an endpoint. The first parameter is the fully qualified name of the contract. The next is the binding. And then we need an address. Now all we need to do is open the service host. We'll print a message to let the user know it's running. And since we'll run it with debugging, we need to stop the console. And there we have a configured web service using API. When we run it, we'll see that it's operating properly. Now we'll discuss configuring a client via API. To get started, you'll instantiate a binding and an endpoint. Then you'll instantiate Channel Factory of T, where T is the contract of the web service. And then you pass the address and binding as parameters to the Channel Factory instance. After you have a Channel Factory instance, call create channel and get a reference to the proxy, and then you can use that proxy to call the service. Let's go see how that's done. Here we have a web service that's self-hosted, and we want to add a client application so that we can configure the client via API. So I'm going to right click, say Add, New Project. This will be a console application. And the next thing we need to do is add a reference to the service so that we can use its types. Okay, now that everything's set up, we can start coding. And the first thing we need is a binding. And that's in the system.serviceModel namespace. And then we need an address. Which corresponds to the service address. Now we have a binding and an address, we need a channel factory. And its type is the service contract type. I'll add that namespace from the generated code. And the channel factory needs the binding and address. Now that we have a channel factory, we can create a proxy. We just call create channel. Now that we have a proxy, we can call the service. And let the user know what the temperature is. And then stop the console before it goes away when we're debugging. And we'll build that, make sure everything's good. So here we have a configured client. We have a binding, an address, and a channel factory that takes the address, binding, and contract, and then we generate a channel from that. Here we get the proxy, and we use it, and then you'll see the results. Now when we run it, we need to make sure that the projects start up in the proper order. So I'll go to Solution, Set Startup Projects, and see how it says single startup project. We need two this time. The host needs to start first, and then the weather client. If you need to, you'll use these direction arrows to put them in the right order. And then I'll go ahead and run the application. Here's the service running. And there's a service client consuming the service. And that's how you configure a client via API. Now we'll discuss how to customize bindings via API. To get started, create an instance of the binding that you need. Then you can customize the binding by setting its properties. What's useful is that some customizations are available via constructor overloads. When configuring bindings via API, you can use the same process on both the client and the service. So let's go see how. Here we have a web service that's configured via API in both the service and the client. What we want to do here is create a custom binding configuration via API also. So I'm going to start in the service. And underneath this binding configuration, I'm going to create a new binding. And in this binding, I'll configure the security mode. Now in practice I would configure this securely, but for the demo I'm going to set it to none. And then I'll make a copy of this and use that new binding, the one I just customized. And then I'll change the endpoint a bit, since we're using a different binding. And there we have it. We've customized the binding. Let's build that to make sure it's good. Next we need to go to the client. And under here I'm going to create a new binding of the same type. And I'll modify its security mode to match the service. And then I'll create a new endpoint address. With the same customizations as the service. I'll copy that to avoid typos. And then we need a new channel factory in service. And I'll make sure that I'm using the new customized binding in the channel factory. And then I'll get my proxy with the new channel factory, calling create channel. And I'll give my proxy a new name. And there I'll use my new proxy to call get temperature. Modify the message. Modify the return variable from the service. And there we have it. We have a binding. We customize the binding via properties. We have a new endpoint address and ensured that it matched the services address where we changed that. Then we have a channel factory that uses the custom binding. We get a new proxy based upon that new channel factory called the service, and then printed out the results. I'll build that to make sure it's good. We need to change that too. And make sure that we're using that new address in our channel factory. Build again. That's good. And now I'll run it. Service host is running, and both of the temperatures printed. So that's a demo on how to customize bindings with API.